Harsheen and Mirka, and we're a part of BookOrators, a global student organization that aims to instill a love for literature in youth. As a part of our guest speaker series, we are joined by Ms. Brenda Peynado, who is an author. Her debut novel, The Rock Eaters, is a short story collection that came out in May 2021. Her stories have won several awards, including a Nelson Algren Award from the Chicago Tribune, an O. Henry Prize, and an inclusion in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, along with many other accolades.
We have reached out to her today because we wanted to share the experiences of Ms. Peynado and her journey to becoming an accomplished author. We are so excited to have you here today to talk to us and our viewers. So to start, Ms. Peynado, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book, The Rock Eaters?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be talking with you both today. So The Rock Eaters is a short story collection that features Latina girlhood, but it also mixes in a lot of science fictional and fantastical conceits. So there's angels perched on rooftops, alien arrivals, there's Latin American superheroes that end up storming the US border. And a lot of what connects these stories together with the, fantastical conceits and the more realistic stories about just, often two Latina girls or two girls sort of trying to understand each other is a lot of that, the desire to connect between people. And a lot of times what stands in our way, which is sometimes physical walls like borders, and sometimes it's the walls we erect inside of ourselves. And the Rock Eaters, sort of the stories across all of them, this idea of like eating rocks to stay grounded, but also trying to connect with each other as that symbolic rock eating.
That is a very nice concept. I think it's pretty unique and very authentic. And as you said, your book deals with many topics which are very sensitive, such as xenophobia and immigration, in a very multidimensional and fantastical way. So, what were the inspirations behind your story?
Each story had a different impetus, but I'm Dominican American, and a lot of the impetus that had me write these particular stories, and especially with the ways that a lot of them are sort of strange or in different worlds, or they add a fantastical conceit to the world, had a lot to do with my upbringing, sort of moving back and forth between the Dominican Republic in the summers and then the United States during the school year, and that feeling of being unmoored and dislocated, but also feeling like that movement allowed me to see things with fresh eyes and with wonder and sort of amazement at everything that was going on around me that people were taking for granted because they had been all their lives in one culture or another. And so that strangeness that all of the stories in the Rock Eaters have is probably has to do with that, that feeling of wonderment that I had as a child, and bewilderment, and sometimes horror, and sometimes gratitude at the wondrous things that were going on around me. I didn't have to research the short stories in this particular collection. A lot of them were drawn from personal experience, people that I'd met. I spent, later on in my 20s, I ended up living in the Dominican Republic full time. And a lot of the stories to do with the Dominican Republic had to do with people that I met. And they often, if you're asking about research, they often had more to do with me thinking about what was inside myself. Like I had a short story, the title story, The Rock Eaters, actually, about a few blocks away from my apartment in Santo Domingo. I ended up always walking my dog to this one little park, and it was a rock-scaped park. And I ended up interacting with the children a lot because they wanted to pet my dog and play fetch with the dog. So there was a lot of wrangling of children. And I thought I wanted to write a story about these kids. And I thought it was about them. It was about them growing up and that feeling of change as they were on the cusp. And I kept trying to write the story that way, and it didn't work until finally I realized, oh, the reason why it doesn't work is because the story is actually about myself. And it's not just about growing up and coming of age of change, but it was also that particular year. I was sort of, since I'd spent so much time in my childhood over the summers and kept going back, I was kind of expecting a homecoming when I ended up living in Santo Domingo full time, and it didn't turn out that way. And so I realized that the story was my feelings about that, my feelings of wanting this to be a homecoming and wanting this to be a home, and realizing in some ways that could never be a home for me, or at least it was never what I had expected and sort of romanticized in my youth. And so then the story ended up becoming about these second generation immigrants who wanted to be of a place that they weren't.
So considering that you are a debut author, did you receive any guidance while writing and compiling your short story collection? And do you have an idol you look up to while writing?
I've received so much guidance that I'm really grateful for over the years. I ended up doing my master's in fine arts in creative writing, and I also did a PhD in creative writing. And all of my teachers there were so pivotal to what I'm writing today. My husband is also a writer, and I would not be the writer. We sort of go back and forth with the ideas that we have writing. And so I ended up, he's my first reader. So, but in terms of the particular writing advice that has stayed with me, one has been follow your joy. Sort of think about what it is that makes you want to love, or that makes you love writing, and pursue that. Because though writing is a business and publication is sort of a slog and a gruel, if you stop loving writing, then it just is a job like any other. And you might as well go be a finance person and actually make some money, because there is a lot of money to be made in writing. But I think a lot of people end up losing their joy. They think of it as like, I have to do this. This is, it ends up turning into a work for them, a 9 to 5. So pursue your joy. And then I would also say, don't pay attention to publication or accolades or awards. They may come, they may never come. And if you hinge your feelings of success or your feelings of fulfillment when you're writing on that, you're putting things sort of outside of your control. And I've gotten a lot of awards, but I've also come to recognize that there's a lot of people that write beautiful stories that never get recognized. And there are a lot of people who write stories that I wonder, why did this get recognized? And so a lot of what you have to place your feelings of success is back to that joy of writing, and also a feeling that you are telling the truth in some way, and that you are witnessing to the truth. Because if you start placing your feelings of external, success on what other people say about your work, then you're relying on other people's senses of reality and what they think you should be writing about, or what they think your story is. And a lot of times, if you're writing cross-culturally, readership sometimes isn't necessarily going to praise you for witnessing your truth or whatever it is that you see in the world. So you have to sort of stay true to what you think is worth saying. And then beyond that, obviously listen to people's feedback when they talk to you about the craft of writing, but stay true to whatever you think is worth witnessing in the world. For me, my particular joy has been writing really wild conceits. I love it when people sprout wings in my stories or do other sorts of crazy things, because that's where my joy in writing comes from. I just gave birth, and I had a lot of thoughts about how I needed to write pre-birth. That's like, I needed 3 hours so that I could do a little bit of procrastination before I, and sort of settle myself down before I came down. And all of that has flown out the window because I have she naps for 45 minutes. And by the time I sort of sit down at my desk, then I only actually really have 20. So I would say write whatever way you can. If it brings you joy to say, I'm going to sit down with tea before I end up writing, then do that, but don't, they're crutches. And some of us enjoy our crutches. And so why not if we can? But if you can't, don't don't despair that you can't because your desk isn't fully clean, or you may be writing out of your car because you don't have time or you don't have a place to write. But for me, it's a lot about, why am I thinking about these other worlds, and why is this joyful for me? And a lot of times I love to play. So I love to, even when I'm interacting with my infant daughter, I'm often making up stories and telling her worlds, because that's playful for me. And so that's fun. So I would say my biggest advice is just to think about writing as play. And figure out for each individual person that joy of what makes you want to write is going to be different. So some people it stems from an emotion. So some people write out of anger. They see something in the world and they're so angry they need to write about it. And that happens to me too. And sometimes that brings people joy, or sometimes people write out of grief. They want to commemorate the things that they've lost. So whatever it is that really speaks to you and compels you to write, follow that. Sure. I am working on a novel that is set in the Dominican Republic in 1965. And there was a war, a civil war then, and then an American intervention in the war. And the novel follows a girl who gets the power to see all possible futures. And she sees her mother die, who's a combatant in the war, in a lot of those futures. So she has to sort of mastermind people across the city to try to prevent her mother's death. So there's the strongest man in the world, somebody who can trade places with their shadow, and someone who can bring people back to life. And she's sort of trying to bring them all to the scene of her mother's death. And I will say that for this book, there's been quite a lot of research and interviews with combatants in the war. And that has taken me quite a long time, though the short story collection ended up not. I have not managed to stay on track with the novel. This novel has taken me, I think we're going on, this is 7 years that I've been researching and writing this novel. And part of it has been because the research has been so overwhelming. And also something that can happen if you are doing a lot of research for the novel or for a short story or whatever, is you end up getting pulled into other people's stories. Because really, when you're researching, you end up seeing all of these things that you're like, wow, that person's life is fascinating, and this person's life is fascinating, and that angle is really fascinating. But in the end, until you figure out what exactly your vision is and what your story that you're trying to tell is and why it is that you feel compelled to write about this, you'll just end up getting sucked into all of these different directions, which is what happened to me, until I ended up figuring out why was it that I was so compelled to write about the Civil War. But in terms of how do I stay on track, I often do outlines. I give myself deadlines. I often miss, but I try to write at least 500 words every day, just so that I can make sure that I am sitting down and I at least have the goal. But I also, I don't kick myself for if I end up meeting the deadline because something else happens, because then that often ends up fueling that feeling that it's a 9 to 5, and those like bad feelings of guilt and you've got to do this to work. So I sit down and I write because I'm enjoying it. And if at any point something else happens, then, that's the day. But that is probably why it's taken me so long to write this one. That's a great question. I was not always the best school. I was not always more motivated. And part of the reason was because I much preferred to read and write. And sometimes strangely enough, I didn't really get that opportunity to do as much reading and writing as I wanted. So I was often in class where they were talking about something, and then I was reading a book separately on my own. But I would say, I think there's often too much of a focus on grades as a measure of success. And so when you ask, like, how do we inspire kids to excel and succeed? Sometimes that's not always with a grade. And sometimes it's having kids identify what is it that they really love to do, and what is it, that sparks their joy, that motivates them, and then set their own internal markers about what is it that would make you feel like you've accomplished something, and then having that be a measure of success. So if it is that you want to, write a novel over the summer with your summer vacation, that has not necessarily anything to do with school, you won't get a grade for it. But if that sounds fun to you, and that's something that will make you feel like you have succeeded in something that you've always wanted to do, then follow that and follow your passions.
And I think that at its core is the very aim of BookOrators, to help students to read and succeed, and not only think about the grades, but also about what really motivates them and how reading can benefit them and enrich their lives.
There's a really great Eastern, I would say, The Poppy War is a really great. I might even recommend The Three Body Problem as a really interesting Chinese science fiction novel.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Ms. Peynado. I'm sure our viewers enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Be sure to check out Ms. Peynado's book, The BookOrators, and stay on the lookout for the next installment of our speaker series. And remember to check out our website, BookOrators.org, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram for updates. See you next time. Thank you so much, Ms. Peynado.
Thank you so much for having me.